The first time Alma said the ghost spoke to her, the adults thought it was just another one of her odd little stories, imaginative, unsettling, but harmless. Mexico in 1980 was loud with life, radios humming in the streets, vendors calling out at dawn, buses coughing dust into the sky. No one imagined that a quiet girl with tangled hair and a voice too soft for her age would be the first to sense something wrong beneath all that noise. Alma had always been a strange child, the kind adults whispered about when they thought she wasn't listening. She was not troublesome or rude or reckless like other kids her age. If anything, she was too quiet, too observant, too aware of things that no one else seemed to notice. Teachers said she stared out windows as if she were looking far beyond the schoolyard, into a place no one else could see. Neighbors said she had a habit of stopping mid-step on the street, turning her head as though someone had called her name, even when no one had. Her parents dismissed it all as a vivid imagination, the sort that children sometimes carry like an extra limb, useful in stories, troublesome in real life. But Alma knew the difference between pretending and hearing something that didn't belong to her. She had known it for longer than she could explain. The first time she told her mother that ghosts had spoken to her, the woman had been peeling oranges in the dim kitchen, the sun just beginning to reach over the rooftops. Alma slipped into the room, her bare feet silent against the cracked tile floor. She stood by the table, wringing the hem of her nightgown with small tense fingers, trying to find the courage to speak. Her mother, half listening, asked if she'd had another bad dream. Alma shook her head, her voice trembling as she said the whispers hadn't come from inside sleep. They had come from the dark corners of her room, from the place behind her wooden wardrobe where dust gathered but shadows behaved as if they had a pulse. The ghosts, she said, had told her that something was coming. Something that would hurt children. Her mother didn't believe her, of course. She let out a tired sigh, brushed the idea away like it was a harmless fly, and told Alma to wash her face and get ready for school. Dreams were dreams, she said. Kids had nightmares all the time. But Alma insisted again, tugging at her mother's sleeve, saying they were not dreams. They were voices. Clear, urgent, afraid. Voices of children who didn't sound alive. Her father took a harsher approach. When the story reached him that evening, he slammed the door loud enough to rattle the picture frames and demanded to know why his daughter was spreading foolish tales. He accused her of seeking attention, of making things up to avoid chores or schoolwork. Alma tried to explain that she didn't want attention, that the voices scared her more than they troubled him, but her father didn't hear the tremor in her words. He only heard what he believed was disobedience. He told her stories about ghosts were for ignorant people, not for families who worked hard and minded their own business. He warned her not to repeat that nonsense again. But the voices didn't care about her father's warnings. They continued to visit her. Some nights they murmured her name from the foot of her bed, soft and trembling as though they were afraid she would turn them away. Other nights they whispered frantically, their breaths cold against her ear, telling her that danger was creeping closer, that other children were crying for help where no one could hear them. In the daylight, Alma tried to push the memories away, tried to pretend she was just like the other kids walking barefoot on the dusty roads or buying sugar candies from the market, but the whispers clung to her, following her into classrooms, into church pews, into the moments before she drifted to sleep. By the time a week had passed, her exhaustion was visible. She looked pale under the early morning light, dark shadows bruising the skin under her eyes. Her hair, usually carefully braided by her mother, began to fall loose as if even the strands were too tired to hold their shape. Teachers noticed her drifting in and out of attention, blinking hard, pinching the skin of her arm as if trying to keep herself awake. When asked what was wrong, she only shook her head. If she told them the truth, they might think she was lying, or worse, they might think she was cursed. But children in the schoolyard noticed something too. They whispered about how Alma had begun to twitch whenever someone walked too close behind her, how she occasionally froze as if she were listening to something others couldn't hear. Some avoided her, fearing she was strange, while others approached her out of curiosity, asking if she knew any secrets from the spirit world. Alma ignored them all. She didn't want their questions. She wanted the voices to stop. Yet with each passing day, the whispers grew stronger, no longer confined to the hours before dawn. By late afternoon, when the heat stretched over the town like a heavy blanket, Alma sometimes heard faint cries drifting through the air, though no one else reacted. These were not random whispers but pleas, children calling out, begging someone to help them. The desperation in their tiny voices made Alma's stomach twist, but she didn't know what to do. She was 11. She had no power, no way to convince adults that something terrible was unfolding beyond what their eyes could see. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Alma sat outside on the front step while her mother swept the floor inside. The street was nearly empty, the noise of the day fading into a sleepy hush. That was when she heard them again, not whispering this time, but singing. A slow, eerie melody carried by voices that sounded distant and hollow, like echoes traveling through a forgotten well. Alma's heart thudded against her ribs. She recognized the sound, the trembling cadence, the way the tune broke at the edges as though sung by lips that no longer had warmth. She didn't know the words, but she understood the meaning. It was a warning. She pressed her hands against her ears, trying to shut it out, but the song only grew louder. Her vision blurred as fear rushed through her. That was when they spoke again. Not singing, not whispering, speaking, as clearly as children standing right in front of her. They told her that danger was already here. And that she was the only one who could hear them because she was the only one willing to listen. The news of the missing children reached Alma's town before the sun had fully risen, spreading across the dusty streets with the speed of a rumor that no one wanted to believe. It came first from a small village 15 minutes away, where a mother woke to find her son's bed empty, the blanket tossed aside as if he had left in a hurry. At first, she thought he had gone to fetch water from the well, but the neighbors hadn't seen him, and the well path was quiet. Then she noticed the back door was slightly open, its hinges trembling in the early morning breeze. By the time the villagers realized he was nowhere nearby, another mother from the same village began screaming that her daughter's window latch was broken, the wind pushing the curtain gently inward, though the night before she had locked it herself. 2 children gone in the span of a single night, without footprints, without noise, without any clue about where they had gone. No broken glass, no struggle, no sign of someone forcing their way in. It was as if the darkness had swallowed them whole. The initial shock turned quickly into fear, and that fear carried itself across the dry farmlands and along the roads into Alma's town, arriving like an unseen wind that brushed against every ear and filled every home with unease. People gathered outside the corner store, whispering about what had happened, some crossing themselves as they spoke, others insisting it must have been kidnappers or bandits. But no one knew. No one had seen anything. And that lack of answers made the fear spread even faster. By noon, it was all the adults could talk about, and even the children in Alma's school sensed something was wrong. The usual chatter at recess had turned into quiet murmurs, their games forgotten as they huddled together, listening to fragments of adult conversations carried through the air. For Alma, the fear was different. It wasn't a sudden shock, it was a confirmation. When she overheard 2 teachers whispering near the classroom door about the missing children, the world around her seemed to slow. The wooden desks, the chalkboard, the distant sound of something heavy being dropped in the hallway, all of it faded until she could only hear the pounding of her heartbeat. The whispers she had heard for days, the warnings the ghostly voices had tried to give her, the desperation in their tiny trembling tones, all of it surged back into her mind like a wave crashing against the shore. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't confused. She was terrified, but not the way the others were. Their fear came from not understanding. Hers came from understanding too well. When she returned home that afternoon, she expected her parents to scold her again if she mentioned the voices. She planned to stay quiet, to keep everything inside her chest where it tightened like a fist. But as soon as she stepped through the doorway, she found her mother sitting stiffly at the kitchen table, staring at the radio as if it held the answer to every fear. A faint broadcast crackled through the speaker, reporting the disappearance, urging parents to keep a closer eye on their children. The moment Alma's mother saw her, she rushed over and pulled her into a tight hug, one that seemed less like affection and more like a desperate attempt to assure herself that her daughter was still safe. Alma stood frozen, unsure how to react. She had never seen her mother this afraid. Her father came home later than usual, sweat clinging to his forehead, his expression tight. He sat down heavily in his chair, loosening his collar as though the air itself had become too thick to breathe. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but trembling with something he didn't want to admit. He said the authorities had found nothing, no clues, no signs of struggle. He said people were starting to talk about things they hadn't spoken of in years, old stories about the area, about accidents and tragedies they had tried to forget. Alma lowered her gaze when he said this. She knew what he meant. The adults were afraid of the same things they had mocked her for. They just didn't want to say it aloud. That night, the ghosts came back. She had hoped, prayed even, that maybe with the disappearances out in the open, the whispers would stop. But they didn't. They grew stronger, louder, as if the spirits had sensed that the world finally aligned with their panic. Alma hadn't even finished brushing her hair before bed when she felt a coldness drift through her room, colder than the night breeze that sometimes slipped through the cracked window frame. She sat perfectly still, comb in hand, her reflection trembling in the dim mirror. Then she heard them. Their voices were frantic, overlapping, as though too many were trying to speak at once. Some begged. Some sobbed. Some shouted warnings that tangled together until the words blurred. Alma backed away from the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. She kept shaking her head, whispering that she didn't understand, that she didn't know what they wanted from her, but the voices didn't stop. They kept calling her name, pleading for her to listen, telling her that something was taking the children, that more would disappear if no one stopped it. Alma pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices seeped through, louder, sharper, urgent. She didn't know where to go or whom to tell. Her father would accuse her of lying again. Her mother would cry. The townspeople would call her cursed. And yet, deep inside, beneath the fear and confusion, she knew the spirits weren't telling her these things to frighten her. They weren't haunting her for cruelty. They were desperate. They were trapped. And they wanted someone, anyone, to prevent what had already begun. The next morning, as the search for the missing children intensified, Alma watched the adults run around with panic, shouting instructions, forming groups, praying beneath their breath. She watched mothers cling to their children. She watched fathers grip tools as if they expected to fight a monster. And through it all, she felt the same sinking truth pulling at her heart. The danger wasn't coming. It was already here. The abandoned railway tunnel had always been a place the adults warned children to stay away from, but no one ever explained why. Some said it was because the structure was too old and unstable, that the walls could collapse at any moment. Others whispered about a tragedy from decades ago, a train that never made it out of the mountains, though no one seemed to know the full story or agree on the details. Whatever the truth was, the tunnel had been left to rot in silence, a place swallowed by weeds, graffiti, and a coldness that lingered even in the heat of summer. Alma had never been there, never even had the urge to wander close, but when the ghosts whispered its name, she felt a chill twist inside her bones that refused to go away. For days, the voices had grown more desperate. They pleaded with her to listen, begged her to understand that someone else would disappear soon if nothing was done. At first, Alma didn't know what they wanted. Their words slipped over each other, overlapping cries, scattered warnings. But on the fourth night after the children vanished, something changed. The voices didn't come as a chaotic swarm. They came as one. A single child's voice, thin, breathless, trembling like a candle flame in a storm, spoke a name she had never heard before. The San Dionisio Tunnel. Alma had no idea where the tunnel was, only that she had heard adults mention it in fragments of conversations meant to be forgotten. She remembered her father once pointing at the far hills and saying, "Out past those trees lies a place you should never go." She remembered an old man at the market mumbling about the tunnel being cursed, that the earth itself rejected it. But Alma had never connected those vague warnings to anything real. Not until the ghost said that was where the danger waited. The next morning, she tried to gather information the only way she could, by listening. Adults in the town rarely spoke openly about the tunnel, but fear had loosened their tongues since the disappearances. Alma lingered near the bakery, pretending to admire the rows of conchas while women whispered about search groups forming in nearby villages. One of them mentioned that the authorities were checking old, unused routes, including the area by the abandoned tracks. Alma's breath tightened. She moved closer, holding a small coin as if deciding which sweet to choose, while the women continued their hushed conversation. They said the tunnel was cold even in daylight, that animals refused to enter, that people who went near it felt dizzy or heard strange echoes with no source. When one woman said a cousin of hers had seen a shadow move inside the tunnel even though it was empty, Alma felt her stomach twist. That afternoon, Alma asked her mother casually, trying to mask her curiosity in childish innocence. "Mama, what's past the hills near the river?" Her mother's face shifted instantly, the warmth in her eyes freezing as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water over her. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she placed her hand gently on Alma's back and guided her away from the window. "You don't need to think about that place," she said, her voice tight. "There's nothing good there." Alma wanted to ask more, but something in her mother's expression, the stiffness of her shoulders, the way she didn't look her in the eye, told her this was not a conversation that would be allowed. The silence itself was an answer. That night, Alma dreamed of the tunnel for the first time. She saw the entrance, swallowed in vines and dirt, its stone arch cracked as if something living had pressed against it from the inside. The air around it shimmered with a faint grayish haze, as though the world there breathed differently. In the dream, she walked toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the earth was trying to pull her away. Just as she reached the opening, she heard the soft sob of a child echoing from within. She woke up gasping, her nightgown damp with sweat. The image of the tunnel burned into her mind. The voices returned before she could even sit upright. This time they didn't whisper her name. They whispered a warning. They told her that the children who disappeared had been taken through the tunnel, that there was something inside it, something using the darkness as a doorway. Alma didn't understand how a place that looked abandoned could hold such danger, but the voices were so full of fear that she began to shake. She asked them what she was supposed to do, how she could help, but the only answer she received was the same: someone needed to go there before more children disappeared. Over the next few days, Alma noticed more strange things happening around town, things she couldn't explain. Dogs howled at night, but only while facing the distant hills. Birds circled the air above the old railway path but never landed on the tracks. Even the wind felt different when it blew from that direction. It carried a smell that reminded her of wet stone and burnt metal. Whenever those gusts reached her, the voices grew louder, as if carried along the wind itself. One evening, while her father was outside tightening the wooden shutters, Alma gathered the courage to mention the tunnel. She didn't speak of the ghosts or the dream. She simply asked whether the authorities had checked the old railway passage. Her father froze. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked almost angry, but beneath the anger was something else: fear. He told her no one should ever go near that place, that nothing good had come from it since the accident many years ago. When Alma asked what accident, he only muttered that some stories should remain buried. He refused to say more. But his reaction told her enough. The tunnel wasn't just abandoned. It was avoided. Feared. And whatever the ghosts were trying to show her was connected to whatever the adults refused to speak about. That night, Alma sat on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest as the moonlight spilled across the floor. She didn't want to go near the tunnel. She didn't want to know what lay inside. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the missing children. She heard their voices blending with the others, swallowed by the darkness they had warned her about. And the only thing she could think about was how the ghosts had chosen her, not because she was brave, but because everyone else was too afraid of the place where the truth waited hidden in the cold earth. The night Alma collapsed began like any other, though the air held an uneasiness that clung to the skin like humidity. People in town were still awake, more from fear than from routine. Parents sat on porches, watching the streets, lanterns glowing weakly against the rising darkness, and children were kept inside, tucked away from the dangers whispered about but never fully understood. Alma's parents were no different. Her mother locked the doors twice. Her father checked the windows and then checked them again. No one spoke much that evening. The silence was heavy, coiled like a rope pulled too tight, waiting to snap. Alma felt the tension most of all. The voices had been restless all day, flickering in and out of her awareness like a faulty radio signal. Sometimes she heard them clearly, a fragile plea carried through the still air, while other times they sputtered into static, fragments of words swallowed before they could reach her. It was different from before. It felt as if the spirits were struggling, as if something was pulling them back into a place where they didn't want to disappear. Their urgency made Alma's chest tighten every time she blinked. She had grown used to the whispers, but not to the fear that threaded through them, a fear that didn't belong to the living. As the sun dipped below the hills, Alma sat in the living room with her parents, pretending to read one of her school books. But the words swam on the page, twisting into shapes she couldn't make sense of. Her mind was elsewhere, listening, waiting. The voices usually grew stronger at night. Tonight they were far too quiet. Too faint. Like children calling out from underwater. She pressed a hand against her temple, trying to steady herself. A dull ache had been building inside her skull since afternoon, growing sharper each hour. She told herself it was only exhaustion, but something deep inside her warned that it was not. Her father noticed the way she kept rubbing her temples and asked if she was feeling sick. She shook her head. If she admitted anything was wrong, he might assume it had to do with the spirits, and she knew he didn't want to hear another word about them. Her mother watched her for a moment, frowning, but said nothing. They returned to their quiet, pretending everything was normal even though nothing in their home or their town felt normal anymore. It wasn't until later, when the crickets began their nightly chorus and the air outside cooled, that something shifted. Alma felt it first as a wave of dizziness, a sudden lightness in her head that made her vision blur at the edges. She blinked hard, trying to focus, but the room tilted sideways for a moment before righting itself. She tried to stand, thinking she needed water, but her legs buckled slightly beneath her. Her mother was beside her in an instant, steadying her, asking if she felt faint. Alma nodded weakly but didn't speak. She was listening again. Listening because something in the silence felt wrong. Then she heard it, a gasp, a small, stuttering cry, like a child trying not to sob. Alma's breath hitched. The sound wasn't coming from the room. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her mind, echoing like a distant scream caught between worlds. She closed her eyes as another voice joined the first, then another, then several more. They weren't whispering now. They were crying. Calling. Pleading. But it wasn't the usual murmur she had grown familiar with. These voices were strained, as though fading in and out of existence, as if something was pulling them away from her, pulling them back toward a place they didn't want to return to. Her body trembled. She tried to clutch the edge of the table, but her fingers slipped. Her mother reached out again, but Alma stepped back without meaning to, pressing her hands over her ears even though it made no difference. Her father stood abruptly, demanding to know what was wrong, but Alma couldn't form words. She couldn't explain that the spirits sounded weaker, their cries fractured, as though torn apart. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, too heavy to pull into her lungs. Then she collapsed. Her knees hit the floor first, then her palms, then her forehead, as the world tilted into a spinning blur. Her mother screamed her name, dropping to her side, shaking her gently as if waking her from sleep. Her father knelt down too, his voice sharp, commanding her to open her eyes. But Alma could barely hear them over the chorus of fading voices inside her mind. The spirits sounded terrified, terrified not just of the danger threatening the living children, but of something happening to them as well. Their strength was failing. Alma didn't know how she knew this, but she felt it deeply, as if their fear were wrapped around her heart. She sensed that whatever force had taken the missing children was growing stronger, pulling the lost and the dead alike toward the same darkness. Her mother pressed a damp cloth to her forehead while her father splashed water on her face, desperate to bring her back. Alma gasped weakly as the voices surged again, not as whispers, but as screams tearing through her consciousness. She wanted to tell her parents. She wanted to warn them. But the moment she forced out a breath to speak, the voices crashed into one final desperate plea. They told her they were losing their strength. Told her they couldn't protect anyone anymore. told her that everything depended on someone who could hear them before they vanished entirely. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the voices cut off, leaving only a hollow ringing silence that felt far worse. Her mother called her name again. Her father shook her shoulders. Alma forced her eyes open, trembling with a fear she couldn't hide anymore. Because the ghosts had never been this afraid until now. The morning after Alma's collapse, a strange stillness settled over the town, the kind that felt less like calm and more like the world holding its breath. Her parents kept her inside, watching her as if she might vanish like the other children if they looked away for even a moment. Alma didn't argue. She felt drained, hollowed out, as though part of her had been carried off by the same force that was pulling at the spirits. But beneath her exhaustion, something else simmered, an unshakable certainty that the answers everyone feared were hidden inside that abandoned railway tunnel. The ghosts had shown her the way, not with clear directions but with the overwhelming sense that everything connected back to that place. Throughout the day, Alma noticed signs that the adults were growing more desperate. Several men rode out toward the outskirts of town, their faces grim, tools clutched tightly in their hands. Search groups moved along the river, calling out names that no one expected to hear answered. Even the authorities who had initially dismissed the supernatural whispers now walked with a caution that hinted they, too, sensed something the living could not explain. Alma watched through her bedroom window as her father spoke in hushed tones with neighbors, pointing toward the distant hills where the tunnel lay buried beneath dirt and memory. She knew they were getting closer to something, but she also knew they wouldn't find the truth unless they understood what happened decades ago, long before she was born. Alma had never asked the ghosts directly about the past, not until now. When night fell and the house grew quiet, she sat up in her bed, whispering into the darkness, asking the spirits to come back, to show her whatever they were trying so desperately to reveal. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the air in her room grew colder, and the faint outlines of voices, light, hollow, trembling, began to form again. They were weaker than before, like embers barely glowing in the ashes, but they answered her. They told her of a train that had entered the tunnel many decades ago and never come out. They spoke of children aboard that train, children traveling with families, with strangers, some heading to nearby villages, others going farther, none aware that the tunnel had already begun to rot from the inside. As the ghosts whispered, Alma could almost picture it, a train heavy with shadows, the air inside filled with a creeping dread that settled in the lungs long before the disaster struck. The spirits didn't speak in complete stories. They revealed fragments, a sudden darkness swallowing the train, the sound of metal twisting like bones breaking, the screams that echoed but never left the tunnel. Alma felt chills travel down her spine as she understood what they were trying to show her. The tragedy had trapped them. Not just their bodies, but their voices, their fear, their unfinished lives. The tunnel had become a vessel for something else, something that fed on what had happened there and never released the pain. Over time, the spirits told her, the darkness inside the tunnel changed. It grew hungry. It grew aware. And then, long after the living had stopped speaking about the old accident, the darkness began to reach beyond the tunnel walls, slipping into the world again, searching for what it had lost. Alma felt a tightness in her chest as the ghosts described how the missing children were taken. Not violently. Not with force. But with a pull, a lure, as if the darkness whispered to them in their sleep. As if it called to them the same way the ghosts called to her. The spirits struggled to explain the exact nature of the thing inside the tunnel, but Alma sensed its presence through their fear. It wasn't merely a place where something terrible had happened, it was a living memory of suffering, a lingering shadow shaped by grief and silence. The children who disappeared were drawn into it, captured by a force that existed between life and death, feeding on the innocence it once consumed in a single, catastrophic night. When the voices faltered, Alma whispered for them to continue, but they grew faint, straining to offer final fragments of truth. They revealed that she was chosen not because she was special, but because she could hear them while others could not. Some people were simply born with the thin veil between worlds already stretched, allowing them to sense what lingered beyond. Alma had always been that way, though she never understood it until now. The spirits clung to her because she was their only connection to the living world, their only hope of preventing more children from being taken. Alma pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat flutter as the ghosts' voices wavered. They warned her that the darkness inside the tunnel was growing stronger with each child it consumed. That it had waited decades to stir again. That if no one confronted it, the disappearances would spread beyond their villages until more souls were claimed and more voices were silenced. Alma's breath trembled as the air thickened around her, the final whispers spilling out like dying embers. They told her that the truth, what truly happened during the old accident, was buried in a sealed compartment of the train, still trapped inside the tunnel. They told her that whoever opened it would understand everything, but doing so came with a price. Her room grew colder still, as though the spirits were using the last of their strength to stay with her. Alma closed her eyes, feeling tears gather as their whispers thinned, fading into a sound almost like wind. She understood what they wanted. They needed someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to enter the tunnel and uncover what had been hidden for decades. Someone who could stand in the place where fear was born and not be claimed by it. Alma wasn't sure she was that person. She wasn't sure anyone was. But as the last whisper faded and the room returned to silence, she realized that the truth waiting inside the tunnel wasn't just about the missing children. It was about the dead ones too, the ones who had been calling her, guiding her, fearing for her. And it was about whatever waited in the darkness, still hungry, still listening.